Hello, folks, and welcome to the Malwarebytes 2022 Threat Review. I am your host, Adam Kujawa, security evangelist and one of the directors of Malwarebytes Labs at Malwarebytes. Been there for over a decade. Don't know why they still keep me on. But today we're going to be talking about basically last year. What happened last year? What happened to malware during the pandemic? What happened to email distribution? What happened to breaches? So we're going to cover a lot of that stuff, and hopefully at the end of it, you'll walk out of here knowing a lot more. So the COVID-19 pandemic, it hit globally. It hit global economies really hard in 2020, including the criminal underground. And malware detections, they fell appreciably because of it. A year later, as coronavirus restrictions were eased around the world, malware roared back into life at record levels. Malware's COVID bounce, as we're calling it, was visible everywhere in detections for almost all types of malicious or unwanted software, both on Windows and on Mac. But in 2020, the restrictions put in place to slow the progress of the coronavirus pandemic created significant depression and economic activity around the world. And in that year, malware dropped, malware on Windows business systems dropped by 24%. But in 2021, it came back by 143%. This statistical change is what we're calling, like I said, the COVID bounce, and it really goes beyond just business detections. Here's just the first example. 2021 actually saw 77% more malicious software detections overall than in 2020, with detections on Windows home computers specifically increasing by 65%. Mac systems also experienced this bounce. Detections increased more than 200% year over year from 2020 to 2021. Why is that? Why did this happen? Well, in addition to causing trillions of dollars of lost economic activity, the pandemic also saw a mass migration of knowledge workers moving from offices to homes. And when this happened, a huge pool of potential targets dried up. This led to a scramble by a lot of cybercriminals to find alternative methods of attack. And last year, as COVID restrictions eased and cybercriminals learned how to target organizations, whether they were in offices or at home, malware detection numbers climbed. Detections didn't simply return to pre-COVID status quo either. They soared past 2019's numbers. In 2021, the detection numbers for business threats were 85% higher than in 2019. And consumer threat detections were 47% higher. So what does all this mean? I'm just rambling a bunch of numbers at you guys, right? But what happened basically is the pandemic hit. All the potential targets that cybercriminals had already been hoping on, expecting to be sitting in endpoints on corporate networks, went home. Suddenly people were using their own devices. They were maybe using corporate laptops. They were on VPNs. They were in, harder to get to, less connected environments. And so the bad guys had to switch tactics. Once they figured that out in 2021 and later 2021, then we started seeing a resurgence of a lot of these big name attacks, big families, and a growth of malware once they've kind of got their bearings and figured out, hey, what are we doing next? How do we attack people in this environment? And it helps that a lot of people went back to work as well. So while the value of crypto, and we're going to talk about Windows threats real quick, while the value of crypto has been really crazy lately and not stable, in 2021, a bunch of crypto coins actually went up in value, and this led to an increase of 300% in riskware tools and specifically cryptocurrency miners. Spyware, adware, and worms all jumped 200% from the previous year. And we have a theory about why this is, and we're going to get into that a little later. It's safe to say that while we can point the finger at the pandemic for all of this happening, for a lot of these big changes that is, sometimes it comes down to the intention and the motivation of the attacker and their passion for making a profit. And it's that will that ends up reshaping the threat landscape. On Macs, the malicious software ecosystem continued to be dominated by potentially unwanted programs and adware in 2021. The year saw a surge in detections for both. Here you can see a listing of our most common MAC detections in 2021. Many of them fall into the PUP category. However, historically, PUPs like these have been used to deliver malware, adware, or create backdoors onto the systems that they've infected. Other top detections like OSX Genio, vSearch, they're both known to be browser hijackers and huge pain in the butts for Mac users for years. Malicious apps that make money through ads continue to dominate the Android threat landscape in 2021. One of the most prevalent, Mobidash, racked up 133,000 detections by hiding into the code of legitimate applications that were then reassembled and uploaded to third-party app stores. Meanwhile, AdNote, which posed as various Office-type themed or Office-type apps on Google Play, was detected over 86,000 times. So why am I talking about adware and PUPs? The presence of dangerous malware on Android and on Mac, it's often overlooked simply because it's outranked by adware in detections and because it often looks different from what we're used to seeing on the platforms we usually use. However, most of the malware types that are out there that we've seen on Windows have made their way over to the mobile side. This includes banking Trojans, remote access Trojans, and even ransomware. Android devices typically travel everywhere with their owners. They're rarely off. They're stuffed full of highly useful functionality like your camera, GPS, tracking your audio. And by comparison, few people take a powered-on Windows laptop with them everywhere they go. So it's a fantastic attack surface for a lot of cybercriminals, and we need to keep that in mind regardless of the less than dangerous nature it seems of the malware that we're dealing with on mobile devices. So while changes in how much malware has been detected is fascinating on its own, let's delve a little bit deeper and look at exactly what threats are being spread through the most common methods of spreading malware in the last 30 years, phishing. Between 2018 and 2020, the email threat landscape was dominated by vast numbers of three big name groups: Emotet, TrickBot, and Dridex. These guys combined accounted for between 75 and 90% of all malware being distributed through email. And as you can imagine, that picture now has changed. Some of those families have gone down, and we're going to talk about that. Email threat detections increased by 56% between the first and second part of 2021. But despite this, we've kind of seen a trend overall over the last 4 years of significant decline. A small part of the change can be explained by Emotet disappearing for about 6 months after a coordinated action by multiple law enforcement groups around the world back in January of 2021. But the truth is that Emotet detections had already been dropping since mid-2019. This predates even the effects of the pandemic. So what is behind this decline in email detections? Well, threat actors appear to be using fewer emails in more targeted ways. Ransomware showed that careful targeting can be extremely lucrative, and malicious email operators may have followed suit. Emotet and TrickBot both started life as banking Trojans that used to compromise targets, steal bank information, but now we're seeing them used to infiltrate corporate networks, move laterally, drop exploits, and utilize any way they can to compromise an entire network, preparing it for the next stage of malware, and oftentimes that is ransomware. And this kind of access for hire is kind of it's the most important cog. It's one of the most important cogs in the ransomware machine. If ransomware can't get out there, how are you going to ransom people? So in 2021, Emotet, TrickBot, and Dridex made up only 42% of detections, and the space they vacated was filled by 6 other malware families operating at a similar scale. Spyware, information stealers, remote access Trojans, and keyloggers, they all dominated the threat landscape. But these tools are better equipped to figure out what kinds of applications are running on a victim system. What network or corporate accesses do they have? What vulnerabilities exist on the machines that they use at home? In addition to stealing credentials, remotely monitoring activity, and creating backdoors, all these tools have been heavily used for bridging that gap between what the cybercriminals know, how we used to operate, how we used to work in offices, how our systems were networked, and now they need to figure out, okay, what's the most common application being used by people working from home? What's the most common VPN? Is there a vulnerability for it? Can I steal some passwords? Can I gain access to corporate resources without even having to touch their network? So the old guard of email threats seems to really be a poor fit for the work from home environment. And yeah, like I said, this all really comes down to figuring out what can be done. If you're used to dealing with malware, you probably know that something like spyware and remote access Trojans, the best thing those things are used for is for intelligence gathering and is for creating some sort of control, or at least coming up with a game plan. And this is really what we saw in 2021, and I think we're going to continue to see that, because this diversification of the threats being spread out there is definitely more profitable in the long run. Over the last 4 or 5 years, it seems like a lot of cybercriminals have been putting most of their eggs in the ransomware basket. So speaking of ransomware, in the last year, events in cybersecurity punctured the public consciousness repeatedly. And terms like SolarWinds, Colonial Pipeline, HSE, Kaseya, and even Log4j took on larger-than-life new meanings. But although the incidents those names now represent will linger in memory, 2021 is most likely to be remembered as the year that ransomware was discussed by presidents and hunted by the military. The ransomware epidemic isn't over, and it may not even have peaked yet. But the threat it poses to businesses and supply chains and critical infrastructure is no longer in doubt. The notable exception to the COVID bounce was actually ransomware, which decreased by 38%. But like I said, it didn't go away. In fact, 2021 has been regarded by many as one of the worst years for ransomware ever. And not necessarily because everybody's got ransomware, but because the attacks that happened were so devastating. Attacks like those on the Colonial Pipeline and the Ireland's Health Service and JBS, the meat supplier, they raised ransomware all to the level of national security threat in the U.S. and made it a topic of discussion at meetings between world leaders. Excuse me. Ransomware caused so much pain in 2021 that it became a concern for the highest levels of government. What followed was a full-throated response involving global law enforcement, cooperation, international diplomacy, and even the U.S. military. This undoubtedly disrupted some of the higher-profile ransomware groups in the second half of 2021, and hopefully some of you have heard about a few of those takedowns. But the decrease in detections is most likely really a simple side effect of the way that ransomware is being used. Over the last few years, ransomware operators have achieved huge year-over-year increases in the amount of money they can demand by focusing their resources on fewer targets. Ransomware operators are not interested in compromising individuals anymore. Their targets are now entire organizations. Trying to steal $300 from grandma to decrypt the pictures of her dog is no longer a high priority for them. Attacks are, bespoke, and the ransomware is run in the final act of a network compromise that can be sometimes months in the making. And by the time it's activated, ransomware is often being run by attackers that have acquired enough power and network insight to disable any sort of security software that you might have running. So that's so much danger behind ransomware and such an effective attack. But basically, the goals here have been, over the last few years, reduce the wide net approach, stop throwing ransomware everywhere so everyone can identify it, remove it, protect against it, and instead go after very specific targets, compromise them first with things like Emotet, TrickBot, lower level intrusion tools, even penetration testing tools we've seen these days like Cobalt Strike being used often to help lead to an eventual ransomware infection. And so yeah, they're not, like I said, it's not the wide net approach anymore. Very specific, very targeted, very bespoke. And that's dangerous for those of us who are protecting organizations, not so much for the individual. So real quick, this is my ransomware recovery plan, and I like to tell people about this. It's nothing special, and it's nothing you've probably ever not seen before. But it's basically a plan to kind of set up your own internal plan on how do I respond to a ransomware attack. And ideally, you want to be able to look at all these things and say, I know how to do for every single one of these items. You want to contain the attack, which means try not to get it, out there. Try not to let it spread to the rest of your network. Establishing the scope helps you to understand what resources are in danger. It helps you understand what needs to be brought back faster. Communication with stakeholders is incredibly important. And that goes beyond just your boss, your manager, your CEO, or your CISO. That goes to who is your cybersecurity vendor? Do you have an incident response vendor? Do you have a cyber insurance company? Do they have a specific vendor you want to use? So you got to reach out and communicate and make sure everyone's on the same page, because that miscommunication can, basically lead to lost time, and lost time means further infection. Seeking assistance, preserving evidence, identifying the threat, all things that will not only help you to know exactly what danger your organization's in, but also help out law enforcement or anybody else that might be assisting you in removing it, cleaning up the thing. So containing the breach, cleaning the infection, obviously you want to do that, rebuilding systems, resetting, patching, upgrading, all things that I know you guys already know about. But one of the most important things, the most important thing, in my opinion, is documenting everything, okay? Let's say that I was in an organization that got hit by ransomware. And it was some new ransomware no one's ever seen before. And I ended up paying the ransom because I lost the entirety of my company's files because I'm a terrible CISO. But the lessons learned from that, I pass on to the FBI, I pass on to the Secret Service, anybody else, and they take that information and they use it to help someone else. They use it to make alerts, they use it to make detection criteria. And so sharing that information not only protects yourself, but protects others, and if others continue to do it, they'll protect you. So that's my ransomware recovery plan. Use it, don't use it. I just want people to know about it. Moving on. So for years, Malwarebytes has tracked the prevalence of Stalkerware, which is a term that we use to describe surveillance apps that are installed on a person's device, often a partner, without their consent. These apps can access a device's GPS location, web browsing history, photos, videos, emails, phone call logs, audio. And Stalkerware also has a known intersection with domestic abuse, where abusers use the information from these apps as leverage to control the subject of their stalking. Malwarebytes separates Stalkerware type activities into two categories: monitor apps and spyware apps. In 2020, detections of monitoring apps and spyware, they saw a spike as the world went into lockdown. Levels of Stalkerware stayed at unprecedented highs for the rest of the year. We hypothesized that the increase of Stalkerware came about because the real-world physical restrictions put in place by COVID-19. In 2021, Malwarebytes found a 4.2% increase in monitor detections and 7.2 increase in spyware detections, making 2021 actually worse for Stalkerware than 2020. But in the second half of 2021, average monthly detections for monitoring apps dropped by 39%, spyware by 20%. Why? Why did that happen? The theory is that since a lot of governments loosened their coronavirus restrictions, allowing the public to mix and travel more freely, and just as the sudden increase in Stalkerware detections mirrored the sudden mass imposition of restrictions, the gradual decline in detections appears to reflect gradual easing. So basically, people were stuck at home, abusive partners, stalkers from outside of the home, whatever, trying to keep an eye on people that they usually would be able to keep an eye on in the office or something. So the amount of these apps go up, the amount of detections of these apps, they go up. People start going back to the offices. They are with friends and family more often. The detections of the apps go down. Unfortunately, it could be, and we'll talk about why that is, another theory that might be true. And I hope it's not true. I hope that everyone just went to work and then Stalkerware vanished. But unfortunately, when Stalkerware saw its distressing uptick in 2020, we at Malwarebytes consulted with other domestic abuse networks, and an increase in detection was confirmed by other members of the coalition against Stalkerware. And it coincided with news reports of increased calls to domestic abuse agencies. But the growth in detections also brought an increased awareness of the Stalkerware problem. And last year, the Federal Trade Commission issued its second ever enforcement against a Stalkerware developer. So we're starting to make some progress. The problem we face is that it's really increasingly easy for abusers to monitor their targets using off-the-shelf technology designed for other purposes. Abusers may simply have turned to other forms of technology as Stalkerware became more widely detected, or maybe they've returned to previous patterns of control and abuse as restrictions ease. They didn't need the Stalkerware anymore. Thankfully, the coalition against Stalkerware continues to grow. It increased its contributors in 2021, accepted more expertise to expand its Stalkerware detection threat list, which antivirus vendors can use to improve their own detection tools. So if you're curious out there and you want to know what kind of Stalkerware apps are out there, go check out the Coalition for Stalkerware. We've got listings of known Stalkerware apps that we can help people detect. As a founding member, Malwarebytes will continue to share its intelligence with the coalition to improve detections while also guiding domestic abuse support networks within the coalition through thorny technical questions of detection, removal, and prevention. You guys doing all right? Everyone good here? Yeah, yes. Entertained? So moving on from details about threats, let's discuss global trends and how they are shaping the threat landscape. So on the afternoon of August 25th in 2021, in the White House's East Room, the leaders of multiple major tech companies gathered to listen as President Biden described the core national security challenge we're facing, the American people are facing, and our economy is facing, which is cybersecurity. President Biden's remarks simply reflected a fact that his administration accepted for months, which is that cybersecurity had become a matter of national security, and it was up to the federal government to step in and do something. So beginning in early 2021, the United States and several other governments began a worldwide crackdown on cybercrime that involved everything from covert investigations to public policy changes and closed-door meetings between superpowers. Ransomware gangs were upended. Malware networks were infiltrated. Computers, cash, and cars were all seized. In January, law enforcement from multiple countries helped take down the Emotet botnet, and then in an extremely rare move, which I still don't know if I agree with, they modified the Emotet update process so that it would deliver code to all Emotet infections, instructing them to delete themselves, which, fantastic. Malware should delete itself, but at the same time, pushing code to someone else's system, it's a gray area. And I think the Germans or something did that. In February, President Biden signed an executive order aimed at improving the security of American supply chains from various threats. In May, he also signed another executive order, this time upping the security requirements for any software that the federal government used internally. And shortly after that, the Department of Homeland Security issued its first ever cybersecurity rules for pipeline companies in the US. And during this flurry of government activity, unfortunately, threat actors raced ahead with increasingly devastating attacks, like the attack against JBS and the attack using an exploit of the Kaseya VSA remote management and monitoring tool, which infected thousands of SMB systems simultaneously. These attacks were launched by the Russian-affiliated REvil group, or REvil, however you want to say it. I say REvil. However, according to the exclusive reporting in the Washington Post, the U.S. Cyber Command, in coordination with another foreign government, compromised REvil's infrastructure so thoroughly that one of their leaders actually ran away. He just ran off in fear, left the other guy high and dry. That's cybercrime for you. But by the year's end, the ransomware groups behind Avedon and Black Matter and DarkSide, the ones who committed the Colonial Pipeline attack, had all been shut down, and they took the opportunity to run away into cyberspace. Oops, excuse me. There we go. Sorry, I skipped the slides. So, but anyway, moving on from that. The thread that linked many of the most important cybersecurity events of 2021 was old and insecure code. And speaking of which, sorry, before I move on, actually, the fact that we've seen so much government intervention and law enforcement activity is fantastic. And we need to see that continue. I really hope to see that continue, because up until over the last couple of years, it seemed like we were kind of on our own in the security industry. So the year began well, 2021, with the long-awaited retirement of Flash, but was otherwise notable for a succession of high-profile vulnerabilities and well-established code bases. In March, we dealt with the proxy logon vulnerability, which found in versions of Microsoft Exchange Server. And it was called a whole new attack platform by the person that discovered it, Orange Side. In fact, the one vulnerability spawned 3 more vulnerabilities: proxy shell, proxy token, and proxy oracle. In June, Microsoft was in the spotlight again with Print Nightmare, which exploited a flaw in the print spooler process to launch code with elevated privileges. And this wasn't an easy code cleanup either, but one that actually required altering legacy code bases, something we're going to talk about more in a second here. No less than 18 zero-day exploits were discovered in Google Chrome's browser, most of them in its JavaScript engine compiler, which not only affected Chrome browsers, but also affected the Chrome-based Edge browser that Microsoft uses. By the end of the year, we were dealing with one of the most potentially devastating vulnerabilities out there. It had a CVSS score of 10 out of 10, Log4j. This was found in a logging component embedded in countless Java applications. And here's a list that'll make you feel good, like iCloud, Steam, Minecraft, and AWS. But while code that was difficult to fix was part of the story, code that we could have fixed or could have patched but didn't remains our biggest headache, one of the biggest problems we have in our field. Every year there are countless examples of organizations being compromised by known vulnerabilities that could have been patched months or even years prior. The problems we discussed speak really of an insecure foundation or insecure foundations. And alongside fast and rigorous patching, secure programming languages, and their practices, coupled with determination to retire old code bases, is really where we need to get to. We need to be able to not only, build on top of, but reinforce. So at the very end of 2020, Reuters revealed that the department within the United States, or departments within the United States government, and some private companies had been infiltrated by suspected nation-state actors. They had done this by breaching the software company SolarWinds about a year earlier, and they tampered with its Orion product and turned it into a backdoor that gave them access into the networks of the highest profile SolarWinds customers. Any lingering sense that this kind of attack, while extremely serious, was something only nation states needed to worry about, were swept under the rug 7 months later, when on July 2nd, the group REvil used a vulnerability in Kaseya to infect at least 800 separate organizations. Kaseya would quickly join SolarWinds in the cybersecurity lexicon as shorthand for devastating supply chain attack. The fragility of our software supply chain was being laid bare elsewhere, too, as code repositories fought off death by 1,000 cuts. And that means basically that, they've been under attack. These code bases, these legacy things that we've relied on have been under attack little by little, and it's going to make a difference. So modern programming is really just as much about assembling software from existing components as it is about writing new code. To service this need, programming languages and environments now come with package management tools that can fetch packages, integrate third-party open source code from vast online repositories with just a few clicks. These components often require other third-party components in order to work, and so on. And those components need more components. Those other components need other components, so on and so forth forever. Whereas at some point, basically, you don't know where it's pulling code from. This makes software development much faster and more efficient, but it often forces vendors and end users to put their trust in significant quantities of third-party code of unknown quality. The Log4j vulnerability was created by accident and in good faith years ago by a tiny group of volunteer maintainers, but was inherited with every project that used Log4j after that, including AWS and iCloud, and a lot of them were left vulnerable simply to a simple but potentially devastating remote attack. As in so many other areas of technology, the cost of expediency is being paid long after the fact. And I think we all can relate to that. We're already far beyond the point of deciding whether or not using untrusted third-party code is a good idea. We don't really have a choice anymore. And we have already embedded other people's code deep into every corner of our ecosystems, and now we've got to address how to secure it. So, here's my pitch. At Malwarebytes, we've been fighting ransomware since before 2011. Though as the ransomware threat grew, so too grew the need for specialized functionality that can more effectively identify and remove ransomware threats. So to that end, Malwarebytes has created its own anti-ransomware technology. We've had it for a long time, it's not new, which basically works by keeping an eye on all active applications and all files running on the system, basically all processes. And it looks for ransomware-specific behavior among those processes. And when it identifies one, like say encrypt files for some random reason, it has a score associated to it. That particular function is, 5% more likely to be ransomware than one that just opens a file. Once enough of these, the score gets high enough, then that it's assumed ransomware. So once it is assumed ransomware, it's killed. The originating file that installed it is found, removed from the system. Very, very good. But to go beyond this, threats like Emotet and TrickBot, which utilize exploits and malicious office scripts in order to gain footholds on networks, can also be deleted by our anti-exploit technology, also not new, had it forever. It monitors specific applications such as your browser or Microsoft Office and blocks any attempts at those applications doing something beyond their scope, which oftentimes means trying to launch, executable code. This prevents many forms of attack from successfully dropping malware onto an endpoint. And if you're the head of security or IT, you need to be able to isolate systems quickly. And in the case of ransomware attacks, or really anything else, you want to be able to do that. Malwarebytes corporate products provide users with the ability to not only scan, update, and monitor installations of Malwarebytes on networked endpoints, but it also gives the admin the ability to quickly separate, isolate those systems from other infected systems, reducing the chance of lateral movement and maybe even saving the company. We can admit that no technology is perfect, and I think anyone that tells you that at any of these shows is lying to you. But while our anti-ransomware tools detect and remove threats as quickly as they can, a few files might get affected, and in cases like that, Malwarebytes offers our ransomware rollback technology, which takes a 72-hour snapshot of your files and configurations and rolls them back in case of a ransomware attack that encrypts things. These are just a few of the features that directly have put a dent in ransomware operations over the years. In addition to this, we also have behavioral-based detections of all of our malicious files, blocking of malicious URLs, in case there's a malware that wants to communicate with the command and control server, as well as lots of other neat features that make us really a fantastic partner in fighting malware. We talked about a lot today, but there's always more to talk about. There's always more to learn. Please check out the Malwarebytes 2022 threat review. Beyond what we spoke about here, we go into more detail about malware statistics, threat trends, predictions, and guidance to help protect you from the threats that we're dealing with today. If you get scanned at our booth, we'll send you a report directly, or you could also scan the QR code at our booth to download the report for yourself. But that's it for me, folks. Take any questions if you have them.
Yes, thank you for that. It was really good. The piece that I really liked was when you were talking about the partnership and the consortium you have to fight Stalkerware.
Yeah.
I was encouraged by that. Along those lines, and certainly based on the historical review, including SolarWinds and whatnot you talked about, it almost seems like, and the question is, do you know of source way work to improve the state of the art in VR and RE to help the country be more proactive, not necessarily wait for the government to do something, but because
So are the individual vendors working together to make it all better?
self-organize and say, we're not going to wait for another attempt. I mean, the last time the federal government actually wanted to pass cybersecurity legislation was back in, 2016.
Yeah.
But I get a sense from you that there's a coalition of willing who might want to, in terms of sharing threat
Yeah.
but also the tooling and solving some of the problems with open source that needs help because less people cooperate the state of open source integrity and analysis and all the different things we can and should do.
Yeah.
Many efforts to try to remedy some of the more systemic problems.
Well, so the question was, do I know of any like groups or organizations that are working to better both the security community in general as well as open source code, right? I'm positive there is probably a consortium of some kind of developers out there that deal with the trying to, retire old legacy code where they can. But unfortunately, the answer to this question is greed. It stopped a lot of stuff, The federal government over the last few years has been working a lot with private vendors and security, developers, things like that, a lot more than it ever has in the past, trying to bring our expertise together, trying to spread it around. But one thing that's probably been the biggest detriment to that kind of thing happening is the fact that a lot of us are, we're connected to whatever organization that we're connected to, and we have, we're not government funded. There's nothing coming in to help us to do our work, regardless of how much the product actually succeeds. So since so many researchers, people out there with the skills are, like I said, attached to these organizations, the organizations maybe don't want to work together so much. They don't want to share their secret sauce. They don't want to, but at the same time, I do see that kind of changing. I've definitely seen in the industry a wave where we're kind of becoming more friendly. We're becoming more, let's work together, let's stop this problem together. And something like ransomware and these massive, massive supply chain attacks are making that kind of stuff even more likely because we know we can't stop it all on our own.
I mean, Log4j, when you take a look at that, you just say, somebody needed a management interface.
Yeah.
And there was no architect. We're talking about a Java component that unfortunately is everywhere.
Yeah.
But, who got to decide to do something like that? It was like, well,
I mean, it was probably just,
nobody, and nobody checked it
yeah.
until it became a problem.
And that's too common.
It's not a vulnerability, it's a feature.
Yeah.
I'm serious.
Yeah.
So that calls out for a shared responsibility from architecture, and I don't think we can retire stuff like you're talking about unless there's a sense of
Oh, we need to be able to replace it.
components are being used,
Yeah.
market sector.
No, absolutely.
I mean, the telecommunications industry does it because of federal regulations. There's certain things that they have to support.
Yeah.
Like public emergency communications, lawful intercept, but there's no equivalent to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's only going to get worse unless
That's why I think I think you're right. I mean, it is only going to get worse to the point. No, I understand. But I mean, you're right. Why don't we have organizations to do that, to focus on that? And I'm sure some exist, but they're probably not very well funded. And as far as like how something like that could happen, I mean, how many of us have just been working on something and wrote a quick script to get something done, just didn't even think about it, threw it in there, gave the program to somebody else. They were like, well, this is obviously perfect, right? I don't have to mess with this. And it just goes on from there, building on top and on top and on top of it. And then whose job is it to go back and fix it to begin with, So yeah, I think that we've just like most things in technology, we've rushed into it faster than we were ready for. And now like I said, we're dealing with the cost. The bills come due. These exploits, these vulnerabilities, these insecure foundations and code bases. They're going to be a huge problem unless we do something about it. And I'm crossing my fingers, man. You know, I don't have the perfect answer for you, and I can't say that they're, you know, the right thing will actually happen in the long run. But you know, we'll do our best. Mm-hmm. So the question was, how do you defend against your developers just grabbing open source code off the internet and throwing it in stuff? Quality control checks. You know, it's probably the best thing to do. Yeah. I know. I mean, but if you're producing software for someone else, I think it's responsibility to do that work. You know, go by line. Doing it for a personal project, like I've grabbed just random script code off the internet and thrown it into something, not thinking about it. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, there's plenty of frameworks to follow. No. No, we need to rebuild. Yeah, but who's going to do it? Yeah. I mean, you know, at these days, we might just be looking at the biggest developers, Microsoft, Apple, you know, Adobe, whatever, and be like, why aren't you doing better? Because you've got the resources. You know, a mom and pop shop can't, you know, necessarily patch all their problems with their software because they don't have the resources for it. But these bigger organizations do. So I don't know. I think that we're going to need a combination of government effort pushing some of these companies, and as well as them taking responsibility and taking it seriously. Yeah. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer than that. Cross your fingers and hope humanity comes through. Any other questions? Oh.
With the growing amount of ransomware, I'm wondering, has any picture emerged about, for lack of a better word, how much integrity the ransomers have? Do they deliver? Do they take the money and run? Or I guess what would be most interesting to me, have they tried to restore and maybe lack the technical chops to restore their data?
Yeah. In some cases, yes. Yes to all that. I think there was a time when it was kind of a coin flip. We would say maybe 50-50 chance that you would actually get something decrypted if you paid the ransom. I think as time went on, it was more about the fear of the ransom that drove most things. Obviously, they could encrypt stuff, and there were decryptors out there. But I would see a pop-up, like a JavaScript pop-up on a website saying, you've been hit with ransomware, send us money, whatever. And it was just a pop-up on a website. It wasn't anything on my system. So it was the fear that they were really trying to focus on there. And at the same time, with the rise of commodity malware and the groups that will develop ransomware specifically for a separate cybercriminal, you know, you've got the guys that develop it, they know how it works. You've got the guy that distributes it, maybe doesn't know how it works so much, or the guy that runs it maybe doesn't know how it works so much, and then things get screwed up. Also, there's just bad ransomware out there. We've seen plenty of ransomware that never could have decrypted anything. Not because that was the intended goal, but because they screwed it up, you know. So, you know, it's just with everything. It's always kind of a guess. The bigger names you could usually rely on to pay, you know, because they have reputations to worry about. But small name ransomware groups, I don't think they care. Yeah.
Is the ransomware, is the nature of it just encryption or is it data exfiltration as well?
It's grown. It's grown. It started. Ransomware was first created back in 1989 by a researcher named Joseph Popp, and all it did was lock the BIOS and say, you know, show up a little screen in DOS saying, you know, send me a check in mail to this address, you know, And as years went on, ransomware kind of went away from that concept of using encryption because it was just kind of a pain. And at the time, most encryption software development was a lot more difficult. Required a lot more resources. And so for most of the time until about 2011, most of what we saw with ransomware was just custom-made algorithms that they would use for encryption. Nothing really great. Then we started seeing groups that would pretend to be law enforcement. The FBI lockers or Interpol or whatever. You're looking at child pornography, you've committed a crime, you're gambling, whatever. We'll just lock your screen, not actually encrypt anything. And that was pretty effective for a little while until we all figured out that we can remove it. And then at some point over the last about 7 years, about 2013, 2012, Microsoft came out with a new code base to make it a hell of a lot easier to encrypt files, just way easier. And so CryptoLocker, which showed up in October of 2013, was kind of the first serious ransomware to encrypt files with serious encryption that couldn't be broken just by figuring out the algorithm. And as time has gone on from there, we've rolled out anti-ransomware tools, we rolled out new practices across the industry for dealing with ransomware and protecting ourselves from it. So they knew they had to go an extra step. It wasn't so much about encrypting the files anymore. Now we've got to make them pay us or else we'll release the files. And so it just grows from there. And will we see something beyond that? I'm not really sure what else there is other than complete operational shutdown kind of thing. That's my theory, is that a big goal of ransomware in the future will be to go after manufacturing plants, other organizations that can't stand to be offline, hospitals, things like that. Otherwise, they'll lose profit like crazy. They won't be able to get their job done. Encrypting some important files is one thing. Stopping operations entirely is another. I'm kind of curious to see what they decide to do with that. Any other questions? All right, cool. Well, thank you guys so much for your time and attention. If you wanted to chat some more, I'll be over at our Malwarebytes booth, but otherwise, have a great rest of your show.